At 14:32 hours on October 24, 1944, Lieutenant Alex Vracu's hands trembled against the control stick. 6 miles above the Philippine Sea, his F6F Hellcat screamed through a sky torn apart by tracer fire. The canopy rattled. Oil streaked across the glass. Through the chaos of radio static and engine roar, he counted them. 50 Japanese planes diving toward the American carriers below. He was alone, and they were everywhere. "This is it," he whispered into his oxygen mask. And then he dove. What happened in the next 10 minutes would rewrite naval air combat forever. What you just heard wasn't the opening scene of a Hollywood film. It was real. And in the next 40 minutes, you're going to discover how a single aircraft, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, became the deadliest fighter plane in naval history and turned the tide of the Pacific War. This isn't just a story about metal and engineering. It's about the young men who flew them, the fear they carried, the courage they found, and the impossible odds they faced 6 miles above an ocean that stretched to infinity. By the time the war ended, Hellcat pilots had claimed over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, a kill ratio of 19-1. No fighter in history has matched it. But what made this plane, built in a hurry, born from desperation, so unstoppable? Stay with me. June 1942. The Battle of Midway had just ended. America celebrated it as a turning point. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The Imperial Navy's advance halted for the first time since Pearl Harbor. But in the ready rooms of USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, the pilots who survived knew a different truth. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, America's frontline carrier fighter, was outclassed. Japanese Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and climbed like rockets. American pilots compensated with tactics and bravery, but tactics couldn't outrun bullets, and bravery didn't stop a Zero from getting on your tail. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had invented the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver that saved countless lives. But he knew it was a stopgap, a way to survive, not win. "We need a fighter that can turn the hunter into the hunted," Thatch wrote in his after-action report. "We need something that doesn't just survive, it dominates." 6,000 miles away, in a drafty hangar on Long Island, New York, Grumman Aircraft already had the answer on their drawing boards. Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer, Bill Schwendler, understood something fundamental about carrier warfare. A fighter plane wasn't just a weapons platform. It was a working environment, a pilot's office at 25,000 feet, where one mistake meant death. The F6F Hellcat was designed around a simple but revolutionary philosophy: give the pilot every advantage. Imagine being that pilot, knowing the engineers behind you designed this machine not for speed, but for your survival. But how do you prove a plane can win a war? You test it in fire. More power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower. That was 600 more than the Zero. It didn't just push the Hellcat through the sky, it threw it. More protection. Unlike Japanese fighters that sacrificed armor for speed, the Hellcat wrapped its pilot in quarter-inch steel plating. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant bullet holes didn't become death sentences. More firepower. 6.5 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. When a Hellcat opened fire, the entire airframe shuddered with the recoil. And visibility. The bubble canopy gave pilots a panoramic view, 360 degrees of survival. You could see the enemy before he saw you. And in the dogfight, that half-second advantage meant everything. The first prototype rolled out of Grumman's Bethpage factory on June 26, 1942, just 4 days after Midway. Test pilot Robert Hall climbed into the cockpit, fired up the double wasp, and took off into a cloudy New York afternoon. 40 minutes later, he landed and wrote in his flight log, "This thing flies like a dream. Get these to the fleet, now." By August 1942, Grumman received the Navy's order, 2,545 Hellcats, immediately. The factory operated around the clock. 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Welders, riveters, electricians, and seamstresses, many of them women who'd never touched an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, worked side by side. They called themselves Grumman's Cats, and they built Hellcats at a pace that stunned military observers. 1 aircraft every hour. By 1945, Grumman had produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats, more carrier fighters than any other factory in history. But production speed meant nothing if the planes couldn't fight. And in September 1943, the Hellcat was about to face its first real test. September 1st, 1943, USS Essex and USS Yorktown launched their Hellcats for the first combat mission, a raid on Marcus Island, a Japanese outpost 1,000 miles from Tokyo. 36 Hellcats roared off the deck planes at dawn. Close your eyes and picture it. Sunrise over the Pacific, deck crews waving, and the sound of 2,000 horsepower engines shaking your bones. Ensign Armstead Moody checked his instruments, glanced at the carrier growing smaller behind him, and felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. "Stay tight," his squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio. "They'll come from above, always from above." 30 minutes later, they saw them. 8 Zeros, diving through broken clouds at 400 miles per hour, sunlight flashing off their silver wings. Moody's training kicked in. Full throttle. Climb to meet them. The Hellcat's engine roared. The airframe vibrated. The first Zero pilot misjudged his dive. He pulled up too late, too close. Moody locked onto him, squeezed the trigger, and felt the 6 machine guns hammer to life. Tracer fire stitched across the Zero's fuselage. Pieces of metal tore away. Smoke poured from the engine. The Japanese fighter rolled once, then fell like a stone into the Pacific. Moody's first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was already on his wingman's tail. This is where the Hellcat's design proved itself. Moody banked hard, used the plane's superior speed to position himself, and came around behind the enemy. 2 bursts. The Zero exploded mid-air. By the time the raid ended, American pilots had shot down 12 Japanese planes without losing a single Hellcat. But Marcus Island was a skirmish. The real war was just beginning. November 1943, Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin atolls in the Gilbert Islands. For 5 days, Hellcats flew constant combat air patrols over the invasion fleet. They intercepted Japanese bombers before they reached the ships. They strafed enemy positions on the beaches. They hunted submarines. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient, led Fighter Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise. On November 26th, O'Hare took off at dusk to intercept a Japanese night attack. His wingman lost him in the darkness. Radio contact went silent. Butch O'Hare never returned. Search planes found nothing. No wreckage, no parachute, just empty ocean. Years later, researchers would piece together what happened. In the confusion of a night dogfight, O'Hare's own side likely shot him down, friendly fire in the chaos of darkness and tracer rounds streaking through clouds. But his loss reminded every Hellcat pilot of the truth they carried into every mission. Skill and courage didn't guarantee survival. Sometimes luck ran out. Would you call that fate or just the cost of war? June 19, 1944. The largest carrier battle in history was about to begin. 9 American carriers steamed toward the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. The Japanese Navy scrambled every available aircraft to stop them. Over 400 planes launched from 5 Japanese carriers. Vice Admiral Mark Mitster stood on the bridge of USS Lexington and watched his radar screen fill with enemy contacts. "Here they come," he said quietly. "Launch everything." 450 Hellcats climbed into a cloudless, tropical sky. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace, led his squadron toward the incoming Japanese formation. Through his gun sight, he saw them, bombers, torpedo planes, and Zeros stretching across the horizon like a swarm. "This is going to be a long day," McCampbell radioed. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots were brave, but by 1944, Japan's best aviators were dead, shot down over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and the Solomons. The pilots flying that day barely had 100 hours of training. Some had never fired their guns in combat. The Hellcats tore through them like wolves through sheep. McCampbell shot down 9 planes in a single mission. His wingman got 6. All across the sky, Japanese aircraft fell, burning, spinning, disintegrating into the Pacific. By sunset, 350 Japanese planes had been destroyed. The Americans lost 30. Lieutenant Alexander Vresu, the same pilot from our opening scene, landed back on USS Lexington after shooting down 6 enemy planes in 8 minutes. His hand still shook as he climbed out of the cockpit. A deck crewman asked him how it felt. He said, like shooting ducks at a carnival. Then he leaned against his Hellcat's wing and threw up. The turkey shoot broke Japanese naval aviation forever. But for the men who flew that day, the memory wasn't glory. It was the sight of parachutes drifting down, enemy pilots floating toward an ocean 1,000 miles from land, knowing they'd drown or die of thirst. It was the radio chatter, young Japanese voices screaming in fear before their transmissions went silent. It was returning to the carrier at night, exhausted, and realizing your wingman's bunk was empty. War doesn't feel like victory when you're living it. It feels like survival and guilt for surviving when others didn't. Every mission started the same way. 0430 hours. Reveille, the ship's loudspeaker crackling to life. Pilots, man your planes. You'd stumble out of your bunk, maybe you slept 2 hours, maybe none, and walk through dim, red-lit corridors to the ready room. Coffee so strong it tasted like jet fuel. A briefing map covered in grease pencil marks showing enemy positions, weather patterns, the route home. The chaplain would lead a prayer. Some men bowed their heads, others just stared at their hands. Then you'd suit up. Flight suit, Mae West life vest, parachute harness, leather helmet, oxygen mask, 40 pounds of equipment that might save your life or drag you under if you ditched in the water. The walk to the deck flight felt like a procession. You'd climb into the cockpit, your cockpit, the one with your name stenciled below the canopy, and run through the checklist. Fuel, hydraulics, magnetos, trim tabs, gun sight. The deck crew would signal, thumbs up, start engine. The R-2800 would cough, sputter, then roar to life. 18 cylinders firing in sequence, the whole aircraft shaking with power. Green flag, full throttle. The catapult would sling you off the deck at 90 miles per hour, and suddenly you were airborne, climbing away from the ship, surrounded by nothing but sky and ocean. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like freedom. What pilots rarely talked about was the fear. Not the adrenaline rush of combat. That was almost euphoric, instinct taking over, training kicking in, the world narrowing to gun sights and targets. The fear came before and after. Before the mission, wondering if this would be the one you wouldn't come back from, thinking about the telegram your mother would receive, imagining your Hellcat spinning into the ocean, water flooding the cockpit, lungs burning as you clawed uselessly towards sunlight. And after the mission, lying in your bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the dogfight. Did you kill that Japanese pilot? Did you see his face through the canopy before his plane exploded? Some pilots handled it with humor. Dark jokes in the ready room, nicknames for their planes. Hell's Bell, Pacific Prowler, the Grim Reaper. Others went silent, withdrew, stopped writing letters home, because what could you possibly say? Dear Mom, today I killed 3 men before lunch. How were the roses in the garden? But there was also something unspoken among Hellcat pilots, a bond forged in shared danger. You flew in sections, 2 or 4 planes. Your wingman wasn't just another pilot. He was the person who watched your 6, who'd dive into a fight to pull you out of trouble, who'd stay with you if your engine was dying and you were trying to limp back to the carrier. Lieutenant Junior Grade Doug Siegfried once limped back to the Essex with a dead engine, gliding on fumes. His wingman flew beside him the entire way, 40 miles over open ocean, talking him through it, giving him visual cues because his instruments were shot. When Siegfried finally caught the arresting wire and rolled to a stop, he climbed out and hugged his wingman without saying a word. Some things don't need words. By 1945, Japan was losing, but desperation made them more dangerous. The kamikaze, divine wind, suicide pilots who turned their planes into guided missiles. Hellcat pilots now faced an enemy that didn't care about survival. You could shoot a kamikaze's engine to pieces, set his wings on fire, and he'd keep coming, trying to crash into your carrier. On April 11, 1945, the date from our opening, Lieutenant Alex Vrashiu intercepted a massive kamikaze raid near Okinawa. 50 Japanese planes, mostly obsolete models, Zeros, Vals, Kates, but each one was a bomb with a pilot strapped to it. Vrashiu and his squadron dove into them. There was no dogfighting anymore, no maneuvering, just point and shoot. Kill them before they reached the ships. Vrashiu shot down 4 that day. His squadron got 19 more, but 3 kamikazes broke through. From his cockpit, 6 miles up, Vrashiu watched them dive toward USS Missouri. He was too far away, moving too slow. 2 kamikazes hit the water, shot down at the last second by anti-aircraft fire. The 3rd struck the battleship's hull. Fire and smoke erupted. Men jumped overboard. Missouri survived, but 14 sailors died. Vrashiu landed, taxied to his parking spot, and shut down the engine. He sat in silence for 5 minutes before climbing out. Later, a reporter asked him about that mission. "We did everything right, but everything right isn't always enough," Vrashiu said. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Across the Pacific Fleet, Hellcat pilots gathered on carrier decks and cheered. Some cried. Most just stood in silence, trying to comprehend that they'd survived. Over 12,000 F6F Hellcats had been built. They'd destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and 209 more on the ground. The kill ratio, 19-1, remains unmatched in aviation history. But those numbers don't capture the cost. 270 Hellcat pilots were killed in action. Hundreds more were wounded, burned, or taken prisoner. And every single one of them carried memories that would never fully fade. The faces of friends who didn't come back, the sound of a Mayday call cutting off mid-sentence, the smell of burning fuel. Commander David McCampbell, who'd shot down 34 planes and earned the Medal of Honor, returned home to Alabama. He never talked about the war. When his children asked, he'd just say, "We did what we had to do." Lieutenant Doug Siegfried became a commercial airline pilot. He flew passengers for 30 years, but he never forgot the sound of a Hellcat's engine at full throttle. Sometimes at night, he'd dream he was back in the cockpit, diving through clouds, chasing ghosts. The F6F Hellcat was more than an airplane. It was the manifestation of a desperate nation's will to fight back. It was born from defeat, from the painful lessons learned at Coral Sea and Midway, from the young pilots who died in Wildcats that couldn't match the zero speed. It was built by workers who believed their rivets and welds could bring their sons, brothers, and husbands home. Every Hellcat that rolled off the Grumman production line carried the hope of thousands. And it was flown by ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, college students who'd never seen the ocean until they reported for flight training. They climbed into those cockpits knowing the odds, knowing that carrier aviation was one of the most dangerous jobs in human history, knowing that every mission might be their last. But they flew anyway. Why? Not for glory, not for medals, not even for victory, really. They flew for the pilot beside them, for the sailors on the carriers below who depended on them for protection, for the belief that some fights are worth the risk. The Hellcat gave them a chance, a fighting chance, and with it, they turned the tide of the Pacific War. Today, only a handful of airworthy Hellcats remain. You can see them at air shows sometimes, polished to a shine, Pratt & Whitney engines roaring with that unmistakable sound, their propellers carving through air the same way they did 80 years ago. When one flies over, look up, listen, because in that sound, that deep, thunderous growl, you're hearing history. You're hearing the echo of 12,000 Hellcats launched from carrier decks across an ocean that stretched to infinity. You're hearing the courage of young men who climbed into those cockpits and faced impossible odds. And you're hearing the price of freedom. It's louder than you'd think, and it never really fades.